This is Kathy from Gadgets Top 321, and in today's video I'm going to be taking a look at Cross Violet. Now if you're getting a feeling of deja vu, it might be because I recently tested Waterman Tender Purple, and that will be one of the purple inks that I compare to Cross Violet. I'll also be doing a writing sample on 52 GSM Tomoe River paper, as well as taking a look at a writing sample that I did earlier on copy paper. And finally, I'll take a look at the results of the water resistance test. Cross Violet came off the nib of my glass dip pen nice and smoothly. It was a pleasure to write with. The swatch that I made with my tweezers is fairly crisp and pretty uniform in color. This purple ink is pretty saturated. The little drip of ink at the end of the swatch has a little greenish silver sheen to it. I'm going to begin with a Pilot 78G with an extra fine stainless steel nib. Writing with this ink is very enjoyable considering how fine this nib is. Very smooth. I believe because it's so saturated and it grabs the paper so easily, you can write with a very light hand, and also because it's so saturated, it's nice and legible. It's just a very enjoyable ink to use with very fine nibs. Next, I've got my Sailor Pro Gear Slim with a 14 karat fine nib. The scribble was a bit brighter with this fine nib compared to the extra fine Pilot nib, which led me to believe that this was going to be a drier writer. It doesn't appear to be, but the ink just looks a brighter purple in this nib. And another issue I have with this Sailor fine nib, depending on the type of paper I use, it's so fine that it's not really scratchy. It's a smooth nib, but it's just so fine that sometimes it picks up paper fibers. But with this ink, it's very smooth. Again, I think it's because you can write with such a light hand that it just makes the writing experience more smooth. Next, I've got my TWSBI Mini with a stainless steel fine nib. Again, just very smooth. Next, I've got my Platinum 3776 with a 14 karat medium nib. Now, if you're not a fan of the glassy smoothness that you get with some nibs, like I got with this TWSBI fine nib, you can see that the TWSBI fine nib is similar in line with to the Platinum medium nib. This might be a better writing experience if you're someone who likes just a bit of feedback. This was very nice. Next, I've got a Pilot Pluminix with a stainless steel cursive medium. This nib can be a dry writer sometimes, and it really stands out as being a dry writer with some inks, but because Cross Violet is so saturated, even though it's writing just a hint drier than the previous two pens, you don't notice it at all. It's very smooth, and some inks, when the pen's not putting down as much ink and it's being spread out like it is with this nib, the ink can look more pale and washed out, but even though this pen is putting down less ink and it's spreading it out, it's not noticeable. Next, I'll be writing with my Quebeco Lily put with a stainless steel broad nib. This is very wet and just glassy smooth. I mean, I really just feel like I'm gonna slide off the paper. It's enjoyable if you like that kind of thing. And finally, I've got a Ginhouse X750 with a 1.5 steel stub nib. Again, this is so smooth that I felt like I needed a little friction on the page just to give me a little control, but it is very nice looking. Okay, while that dries, I'll take a look at the writing sample on copy paper. Now this is a thicker copy paper, and you can see the two recent purple writing samples. We're getting just little dots of purple showing through. And if you look at this, Cross Violet and Waterman Tender Purple, they're pretty much indistinguishable. One of the things I mentioned about Waterman Tender Purple and that is similar to Cross Violet, even though it's bleeding through the paper a bit, I'm not really seeing any feathering. The edges of the letters in the wetter pens are maybe a little ragged, but I wouldn't call that feathering. The pens really felt nice. The Sailor Pro Gear Slim maybe felt a little dry on this more absorbent copy paper, but even with the Waterman Tender Purple, it was just okay. So these two inks feel basically the same in the pen. My Tsubame ink cards that I made for Cross Violet is almost identical to the card that I made for Waterman Tender Purple. The amount of shading that you get is almost identical. The type of sheen that you get, just the little bit of sheen that you get, is very similar. The way they behave and feel in the pens, these two inks are almost identical. Another similar ink to these two is Rohr & Klinger Cassia, although it has just a hint more blue in it, and a couple inks that are a little less saturated but still a similar type of purple are Iroshizuku Murasaki Shikibu and Sailor Fuji Sugata. I like the looks of really all of these for letter writing, but my favorite purple ink for journaling or taking notes is still Herbin Poussière de Lune. I was hoping that since Cross Violet and Waterman Tender Purple were similar looking purple inks, I was hoping that one of them might have a water resistant component, but I had to label my water resistance test because it was not water resistant at all. And finally, the writing sample that we did on 52 GSM Tomoe River paper. A little bit of the ink began to bleed through on the swatch, the heaviest part of the swatch, and I'm seeing quite a bit of show through, but this paper's so thin that you get that with any highly saturated or dark colored ink. I'm getting just a little bit more sheen on this little blob of ink than I did on Watermelon Tender Purple, but I'm not really seeing any sheen in most of the writing. Well, I do take that back. In the two stub nibs, I'm seeing just a bit here in person. The shading is very subtle. It's not really in your face because this ink is so bold to begin with. It's just very pleasant to use, whether it's a broad nib or a fine nib. But Cross Violet and Watermelon Tender Purple are so similar. I don't feel like you would need to have both in your collection. They're both very well behaved, great inks to use in any type of pen. If you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.